People regularly ask me what they can do for their hips. So today we're going to go over a few different elements you can use just as a base level beginner introduction to hip mobility and teach you a little bit about the hips function and where to start and how to learn what your limitations are. Later on, we'll start to give you more in-depth drills you can use to improve the range, but this is a great starting point. First off, we have to look at the hip's basic function. What are some of the ranges of motion, what they're called, because this will help you later pinpoint where is your limitation. If someone says my hips are tight, but they can fold forward, they have good hamstring range of motion, and it's actually external rotation that they're limited with, it makes more sense to work on the external rotation than just more hamstring range of motion. So you have to be able to kind of self-diagnose which range of motion is it that I'm trying to work on. You can find many guides far more in depth than this, but a quick variation. We've got hip flexion, which comes from folding forwards, of course stretching and or strengthening through the opposite tissue, the hamstrings. We've got external and internal rotation of the hip, and of course we can do this on both legs. We can do it in other loaded positions, moving the legs. There's abduction of the hips where we move them apart, and this will stretch all the adductors, they're called, or some of the groin muscles. And of course, we've got our hip flexors, so we need to make sure that we are stretching through the front of the hip as well. To start as a warm-up, we're just going to do some hip circles, putting all the weight on one foot and making the biggest circle you can with the pelvis. The other foot's helping me with balance, but I'm making the largest possible circle I can with the pelvis and the hip. It's important when you do this to make sure you're pushing your hips forwards and not your stomach and arching the low back. Make sure that it's actually the hip going all the way forwards in front. Now we're going to look at a bit more internal and external rotation of the hip. These are often very limited for people. It's a very basic function of the hip and the shoulder is this rotational element, and yet we really lack it in our modern, relatively sedentary lives. So this is a very gentle one to help warm up. You're going to support yourself on your hands behind your body, lift up the hips, and I'm pivoting my knee down to the ground, pivoting it out to the ground. So I go down inside, this is internal rotation of the hip, and then I pivot to the outside. The more you keep your pelvis from moving, the more isolated it's going to be in internal or external rotation of the hip. If you can't get down to the ground, that's fine. Don't jam it or just try to turn your whole body to get there. Just feel where your limitation is in the internal rotation or in the external rotation. Of course, there is going to be some other moving parts. You can see as I go out to the side, my pelvis drops a little bit, and that's all right. But really try to feel the rotation happening in the ball and socket joint as you do this motion. I just want you to do 10 on each side. That's 1, 1. The order doesn't matter. You can do internal, external, external, internal. Just make sure it's even numbers on each side. And notice if there's any differences side to side. Now that we've looked at internal and external rotation on the floor a little bit more, we're coming back to the standing. We're going to do a few more circles. This time we're doing 10 circles with internal rotation of the standing leg. So you can see I've turned myself to the side, internally rotating the hip, which may reduce your range. Of course, do not go to pain, but just find where do I have those ranges, and we'll do it with external rotation as well. Same idea of both directions. You can do 5 to 10 of each direction, each orientation, internal and external, and each leg. If you're short on time, you can do both legs at the same time, internally rotating the feet and externally rotating the feet as well. Next up, we'll be looking at the Cossack Squat and the diagonal stretch and be putting them together into a bit of a combination. So when doing a Cossack Squat, you may need to elevate your heels. If you can't do this flat-footed on the one leg, put something underneath the heel, but we need to improve that ankle range of motion as well. Legs will be apart. I go down to one side. My free foot goes toes up to the ceiling, and I press myself back up. If you're just doing Cossack squats, you can alternate sides here or repeat one side over it. So notice with this, we are getting a nice one-legged squat on one side while forcing a bit of a stretch through adductors, the groin muscles, and or hamstring, and a bit of external rotation on this outstretched leg as well. The diagonal stretch is looking at the hip flexors. When we do the diagonal stretch, we want to load the back leg as much as possible, and it's going to go to whatever is the tight link in the chain. So because the knee is going to be bent in back, this might go a little bit lower in your thigh, but if that's the limiting factor, that's all right. We are doing this to get a usable position, and you'll see it time and time again in human movement patterns. So we're trying to strengthen that back leg, which is why it's bent, and we shift our weight to it. So for the diagonal stretch, my feet are on one line, I bend both knees, squeeze the glutes, push the hips forwards already. You should start feeling a stretch through the front here. Notice how low my back knee is. If you have knee problems and this is painful, maybe it's not quite ready yet. But keep that back knee low, and this front knee should not go forwards. It stays behind the foot. While I'm squeezing my glutes, I lift my chest up to the ceiling because we don't want to crank into the low back. However, we want to lift through the upper spine, the thoracic spine. I rotate away from my back leg and touch something on the back of the leg. I make it harder by reaching further down the leg, wherever that is. Make sure, again, that you're doing this, feeling it through the front of the leg and the hip, not in the low back, and the back leg isn't too straight. Keep the back knee low, shift the weight onto the back leg. So when we put them together, you'll notice there's rotation to one direction and then rotation to the other direction. I'm going to start with my diagonal stretch, reaching as far back on the leg as is appropriate. I come forwards, switching into the Cossack Squat on the other side. Still coming up, still rotating clockwise onto the other diagonal stretch. Now I start counterclockwise into Cossack Squat. Still counterclockwise as I come up into my diagonal stretch, and we're back at the beginning. Cossack, diagonal, and so on. The 4-position lift, or the shin box. We've got a whole video on this one by itself, as there's tons of details and things to pay attention to, and if your knees aren't great, it can cause issues there. But it's nice because it's going to be working on internal rotation of the back leg and external of the front leg, if that's a limiting factor. If you need more details, go check out the YouTube video all about the 4-position lift. But the quick version is to shift the weight into this back leg after making the shins a 90-degree angle. This is sometimes called a shin box because it looks like a box with my shins. I press the knee, shin, and ankle into the ground, and I use that to lift myself up. Squeeze my glutes, push the hips forward, twist away from the back leg, and then I sit back down. Start with 5 reps, holding the last one for 10 seconds, and we advance to 10 reps and a 15-second hold. When you get to that final rep, it is a hold, not sitting at the bottom or at the top, but the hold comes from sitting back down as low as I can before I sit on the ground, and I hold it there for the 10 seconds. So we've loaded that internal rotation, and we're building strength in it. If the external rotation is quite bad, or the internal rotation is quite bad, you'll be shifting weight onto the front leg, and we'll be strengthening that one. We want to move the focus to the internal rotation, as this tends to be a harder thing to develop. But if that's where you're at in the beginning, that's fine. It will come with time. Any knee pain, any pinching or anything in the hip, stop. That needs to be addressed first. Go see a professional, or maybe go look at the details in the 4-position lift and see if there's an adjustment that works for you. Finally, we've got the Straddle Good morning. A good morning is a folding forwards action, and we're doing this in a straddle with the legs. So my feet are facing forward, my knees are completely straight. Unless there's knee pain, then we have to adjust slightly. And all the range of motion is coming from folding at the hips, so my back remains completely flat. As I do this, we push the hips backward. This is where the load comes from. Pushing the hips backwards, reaching overhead as a counterbalance, and coming back up. I want to be sure that I'm not rounding my back at any point. We are working 2 things here. 1, hamstrings, 2, adductors with the legs apart. Again, the groin muscles. All these muscles are a bit of an interface from the inside to the back of the leg, and there's not going to be a clear divide of when one starts and one stops. They kind of help each other out with function. So the wider you go, the more it's going to challenge the adductors. The higher you go, the more it's going to be hamstrings. But this is a bit of a combination, going for a bit of bang for the buck for your time, and it's also getting a bit of external rotation in the hip as we go forwards. So really make sure to keep the back flat, push your bum backwards, reach overhead for the counterbalance, and come back up. You can start with 5 reps, holding the last one for 10 seconds, and then we'll advance to 10 reps and a 15-second hold.